Welcome back, everyone, to Pontos Fathom Press. This is our Pontos Fathom podcast, episode number 64. We're going to jump into the Mysterium Coniunctionis of Carl Jung. We've got this massive tome on the table here. This was Jung's last work. It kind of caps off his later writings. So you think of Jung, maybe it's starting with Aeon, then alchemy and psychology and alchemical studies are kind of in this group of books where Jung kind of got into the alchemical relation between what he discovered in his practice in the unconscious with, writings of alchemy. And I think if you think of it as a lot of what we do on the channel here is we jump into the I almost want to call it like the kind of mindset that one might have if you were going to be world building for a novel or an anime or something like this. That world building helps us to employ our imagination a bit when we're looking at these. We've also got the book on the table here called The Mysterium Lectures. This is Edward Edinger's journey through Jung's Mysterium Coniunctionis. I'm going to go through just the introduction, the first chapter or so of it. Maybe this will be an ongoing series. Talk a little bit about where this sits in Jung's work. But I think the sort of the hidden magic of this, and we've got Crowley's magic on the table too, is when you go through this, I can't help but think of either, and we've done this with Lovecraft, right? Where Lovecraft was not much a fan of the mystical writings, but when you do observe Lovecraft, like we do in Cat 2 Journals out of Lovecraft's Providence, you start to see that there are certain overlaps, certain synergies, certain connectivities to real psychic phenomenon, real esoteric phenomenon, things that he might have used as vehicles for his horror writing, and almost reluctantly or inadvertently, Lovecraft seems to have stumbled upon things like theosophical, anthroposophical, and even, think of it as ancient aliens, ancient worldview, lost history, alternate science, remote viewing. So many topics kind of come up in Lovecraft that a lot of people, including myself and in the writing that we publish in Pontos Fathom Press, explore. Well, in that same vein, I think that contemporaries to some extent, Crowley and Jung, I want to almost put forth a hypothesis, maybe is the word, but was Jung actually inadvertently doing magic? Right? Is this actually a magical system? So I think one of the things that's interesting about if you think about history and the traditions of, say, magic traditions or mystery school traditions, I want to do a podcast on the immortality key. In undergrad, I was a student of Carl Ruck. I think Ruck shows up in places like in this edition of John Allegro's The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. Carl Ruck wrote a lot about the Eleusinian mysteries, secretive mysteries of Eleusis. And I think that when you start going into what was the real history versus what was dogma, I think we do a lot of that exploration here on this podcast. But we're going to start out with Jung's Mysterium Coniunctionis, his final work. I believe in the foreword, it tells us that he worked on this for 10 years at least. It's first published in 1955, 1954, something like this. Maybe 1963, but maybe completed in 55. But he had been working on it. He finished it in his 80th year. And it's sort of, like I mentioned, fits with the psychology and alchemy, alchemical studies, Ion. What's nice about this book, obviously there's Jung's erudition and his love of footnotes. But what's nice about this Edinger collection is he kind of walks us through it. So I'll kind of lean on Edinger's journey through this. This Mysterium Coniunctionis is no joke. I mean, if you jump right into the beginning, Jung starts talking about things like, the beginning he starts out with opposites. So the first chapter here is talking about the components of the conjunction, okay? And the factors which come together in the conjunction are the pairing of the opposites, right? So the conjunction of opposites, the conjunction is defined by opposites. You know, so when we think, I always think of the word conjunction astrologically, right? So when we have a planet conjunction in conjunction with another planet, sometimes those planets can be opposing in the orbit, but now that orbit closes, right? And so he goes through the list of all of these facts about it. He says that there's earth and heaven, there's fire and water, there's dark and light, there's passive and active, east and west, living and dead, male and female, sun and moon. And then it says, he comes right out into saying that a polarity is often arranged in a quaternary. And he sort of shows an example of that in this way, where you have, once you have a pair, then you have a cross, right? So the idea here would be, in the pairing of something, you right off the bat you can set up an axis for that. So if you have an opposite, right? So this and this are opposed, but then we get this four state, right? Where now you can have this quadrants where this is a thing and this is a thing, and now it becomes, and actually this is the symbol of Earth. While we're speaking of symbols of this, I want to kind of give a shorthand to what I think about this journey here. I've got this note up here. In astrology, the conjunction symbol, I believe, is symboled like this. That's the conjunction. And I was thinking about the alchemical symbol of the sun, which is this. And I thought it was odd how that sun is actually kind of, if you tilted this through another dimension, right, it's actually a ring. So it's actually Saturn, which is kind of an opposite, right? So, you would have Saturn opposed sun conjunction, right? So then you start to see how if you turned this as a sphere, and I kind of did it here, if you kind of rotate this, it's the dot. So the conjunction, so anyway, this is kind of like where my mind wanders when I'm being creatively thinking about the conjunction of opposites. And then, this is going to lead maybe even into the things like the tarot cards from Crowley. So let's kind of go into it. So he starts out with the opposites, and then he talks about the signs of Venus, Mercury, Saturn, and Jupiter all have that cross represented in them, right? So you have, again, in the drawings here that I have, you see the symbols. Jupiter has a cross, Saturn has a cross, Mercury has a cross, Venus has a cross. And then if you go to Jung's footnote, right off the bat, he says, John Deed's Monis Hieroglyphicus, Theatrum Chemicum 2, page 220, right? On the other hand, the view of the ambiguity of the alchemist's language, which is tam ethris quam physicae, as much ethereal as physical, while it is worthwhile to rather go more closely into manner of the text treat the opposites. Very often the masculine feminine opposition is personified as the king and queen, as in the Rosium Philosophorium, also as emperor and empress, which we're now getting into the space of things like the tarot, right? So I'm already here at a magical reference, right? When we're talking about the emperor and the empress, these are kind of things that end up out of Crowley, right? Do we have them here in the cards? The emperor and the empress are key members of the tarot, right? It says the eagle in the toad comes up in Michael Mayer's alchemical writings. So the eagle flying through the air and the toad crawling on the ground. So that's even more interestingly. And so now it goes in that the eagle, which flies up in the clouds and receives the rays of the sun, and the toad is the opposite of air. It is in a contrary element, namely earth, where alone it moves by slow steps. and does not trust itself another element. Its head is very heavy, and it gazes upon the earth, upon the house that it was built. Another favorite theoromorphic image, I guess that's theoromorphic images of the two birds or the two dragons, one of them winged, the other wingless. The wingless bird or dragon prevents the other from flying. They stand for Sol and Luna, brother and sister. They are united by means of the art. In Lamb Spring's symbols, they appear as the astrological fishes. So maybe there's like the Piscean image, like the Pisces image, which Jung goes into so much about in the Aeon and things like that. The water they swim in is Mare Nostrum, our sea, and interpreted as the body. The fishes are within and out bones and cortex. For them, aqua permanens, the permanent water. Another symbol is the stag and the unicorn meeting in the forest. So I guess what he's talking about here is sort of like, it reminds me a little bit of like the Heideggerian fourfold root kind of thing, where there's, man, folk, earth, and heaven, something like this, are the four demarcations. So whenever you have an opposite, kind of like an I Ching thing, when you have yin and yang, then you also get the points of the compass come from that. You get north, south, east, west. You get fire, water, air, earth. So, and then each division then creates new nuances. And this is sort of like the Genesis. It's almost like a Pythagorean Genesis, but then it's also the real Genesis. First there was this, and then the heavens are separated from the waters, something like that, right? Let's just check in here before we get into the Quaternio, which is where we're going to. Let's just see what Edinger has to say about this stuff. He is very clear in his writing as a professor of Jung. He says that the book Mysterium Coniunctionis is the summa of Jungian psychology, and he says the Mysterium book is like the psyche itself. It's an ocean, and you must take it seriously to run the risks of drowning. Now, right off the bat here, this is very interesting, and I know this is Edinger, and Edinger is not going to be writing as a Jung as a magician, but when I read these works from Crowley, what's interesting about Crowley, which I did not know, is when you go through this Liber 4, he starts out talking about the history of yoga and mysticism. It's nothing to do with like Satanism and these things. It's just about, you need to understand your relation to what these yogic practices were, like what the spiritual sciences of the great traditions were, right? And he talks about Zoroastrianism, he talks about Hinduism, he talks about Kabbalah. He's talking about things that were discovered, and thought about. And he gets us right to the tree of life, which Jung is also going to get us to in a moment here. So Edinger continues, he says, so just like the Crowley book, Jung is going to go across all kinds of tradition, mostly Latin and Greek, but it's going to be across a number of traditions. The Mysterium is not exactly the language of the unconscious as it appears in myth and dreams. It is not a fairy tale or a myth or a dream. Its subject matter, it is the content of the unconscious. He says it's almost like a fact list. It's like Jung sat down to make the ingredients list of everything that can be found in the unconscious. But it's different than the unconscious, And he says, medieval natural philosophy, alchemy, he says, we must turn back to those periods in human history when symbol formation still went on unimpeded. That is, when there was no epistemological criticism of the formation of images. And this kind of takes me back to the sort of Cult of the Black Cube stuff, the Arthur Moros, David Beth things from the Theon Press, that kind of the faceless man, and that which also gives it to Lovecraft like we do, this idea of going back to, Nyarlathotep is not only was he the Egyptian guy and he's like the Tesla guy, like today he appears as Tesla. In Egypt, he appears as a pharaoh, but actually he's something from beyond that goes back to, as a thought, something like this, So I think in that same idea of what we're talking about here is categories of one's own fantasy, the phenomenon of the outer world as seen as a test tube or the retort. One can't do that anymore in modern science because there is, to use the fancy terms, epistemological criticism. When a distinction is made between the subjective source of data and the objective source of data, that's epistemological criticism. So that's like sort of to say, I want to do a whole maybe my next podcast, I want to do a podcast on the proof of astrology, kind of is astrology BS? That's the thumbnail. And the idea would be, at what point do you still agree with me? And I'm going to say, okay, let's start out. Astrology is BS, right? But what about, do you believe in day and night? Okay, so, oh yeah, we believe in day and night. Okay, well, that's a cycle of the Earth's rotation. Does that have influence on you? Right, so I think the big argument of science is like astrology doesn't have influence on me. And I think maybe they don't know what they mean by the word astrology or how broad it is, right? That's where their epistemological criticism comes in. But I think if you were to turn it into a series of questions to ask them, well, do you believe in the diurnal influence? I mean, yeah, it influences sleep. Different animals habitate in different things. Okay, so the Earth's rotation, as evidenced by the sun's movement through the sky of a local environment, does have effect on us. Okay, so sun motion has effect. Check, right? So we got in the first hurdle. The sun changing through the sky has effect. What about the sun through the seasons? The Earth year? Check. So the year, that's the sun's progression through the zodiac, has effects on us. Check, right? What about the moon cycle? Tides, menstruation, things like this. Check. So now we've got the sun and the moon established as influencing human life. And if we kept going in a way that's sort of, let's say, in the gray area of the epistemological criticism, but holding the epistemological criticism in suspension, and then just asking these, almost like Plato's Meno, asking these questions about, well, where do you stop? Where am I being inconsistent with you? And then lead to, the very Jungian idea of the astrological significance. I've seen the criticism of the chthonic Saturnians saying it's under the earth. Well, if I go back to that drawing I gave you, at what point did you not think that Saturn as the seventh sphere ruler was not under the earth? I mean, because if you just flip the sun symbol on its side, it's actually Saturn overhead. And then if you look at this great axis of the conjunctio, it's actually an axis going down into the center of the earth, right? And which is also, again, the earth's, this is the earth axis here, right? So again, are we really talking about, and I guess what Steiner would talk about in this would be that there's a mystery of fourth dimensional seeing and third dimensional seeing. Maybe that's another Mysterium Coniunctionis, right? Anyway, so go back to it. The alchemists lack that. So anyway, this kind of thinking that I'm doing for you guys right now, this kind of performance I'm giving you of a podcast within a podcast, right, is the alchemists' fantasy flowing freely, as Edinger says, into their descriptions. And as a result, we have this marvelous panorama of the objective psyche unfolding before our eyes. It's that vast literature of alchemy extending over many centuries which Jung has mastered in an absolutely astonishing tour de force. And then, so we're going to go into the descriptive nature of the Mysterium. So in the next part of this, he's going to talk about moving past the opposites and into the quaternio and the mediating role of Mercury. Well, here, so again, in the free flow of alchemical free-form fantasy thinking, even our play within the play, our podcast within the podcast, led us from the sun to the moon for the for the astrological skeptic. And now we're led to Mercury, right? Maybe this is a property of the Mercury. The arrangement of the opposites in the quaternary is shown in this interesting illustration in the Vivendrium Chemicum, figure XLII. Where are all these figures? XLII, are they somewhere in here? Figure XL, figure XLII. I don't see any figures here. Oh yeah, this figure, XLII. Yeah, so this figure. But I think we also can go to Edinger. I think he gives us some images here. Here's the two fishes in the sea. Here's the male and female lions, right? The factors which come together in conjunction are conceived as opposites, either confronting one another in enmity or attracting one another in love. And this is what Edinger calls a blockbuster sentence. So you see the two fish in the sea, the male and female lions, one winged, one not winged, right? Wolf and dog fighting, right? The elevation of the human figure to a king or a divinity, on the other hand, in its representation in subhuman theomorphic form, are indications of the conscious character of the pair of opposites. This is a very important part, Edinger says. The fact that the pair of opposites are presented on the one hand as royalty, something more than ordinary human life, and on the other hand as animals, is a transconscious character of the pair of opposites. They do not belong to the ego personality, but are supraordinate to it. The pairs of opposites constitute the phenomenology of the paradoxical self, man's totality. Yeah, okay, so this is a kind of interesting idea. So this is, so the Jungian self, let's just think of, again, we have opposites. There's the conscious and unconscious. But then even within the unconscious, there are things like the complexes. There are things like the animus, the anima, the shadow. So it's like Jung had discovered regions when he began to subdivide the sort of solar table, let's call it, right? When he starts to subdivide that solar table, he starts to find more parts of the unconscious. And yet that whole egg, conscious, unconscious, within the conscious there's subdivisions too. There's the ego. There's the persona, which is the mask, you are you, which is the light of your consciousness, but you also project out a persona to the public world. So all these are components, conscious components and unconscious components of this greater thing called the self, right? And in some ways, that's the conjunctionis, the mystery of conjunction is that how can the self be a containerizing of both conscious and unconscious things in one being? Well, it's just the nature of the self. It's the nature of the mystery, right? So to go on, he talks about the quaternio and the two malefics of Saturn and Mars. Mars is the ruler of Aries, Saturn of Capricorn. And then the two other ones of Moon and Venus. And the opposition stands, thus are masculine and feminine on one side, good and evil on the other side. He speaks of the four luminaries. He does not know how to save himself from them. He suggests that he is subject to haimarmene, right? This is the Ostanes, the compulsion of the stars. That is, to a transconscious factor that beyond the reach of the human will. Apart from this compulsion, the injurious effect of the four planets is due to the fact that each of them exerts its specific influence on man and person and makes him a diversity of persons, whereas he should be one. Well, this is just, again, this is ancient. So what is Jung doing here? He's finding ancient evidence into the exploration of the complexities of the human psyche, of the human unconscious. How can I be both conscious and unconscious, right? Like when something gets triggered in someone's collective unconscious, that part shines up, right? And I think that this mapping of what the self is, this work begins with Jung, but then I think it's explored by different psychiatrists and psychologists over time, with Freud, with Adler, with the work of Stephen and Pauline Richards on Jung to Live By. That's another great YouTube channel if people are interested. They do an amazing job of grounding and even freeing us from, a lot of what Jung is doing is less about psychology and it's more about Jung being Jung, right? This is just kind of I want to almost call it experiments. And that's why I have Crowley on the table here, because I feel like this is actually Jung experimenting with a worldview, as opposed to and this is in his later years, these are not things that are part of a practice. Although I believe Jungians probably can employ these things in psychological practice, right? And I think that's where Stephen Pauline Richards do a great job of let's say, as a practical psychologist, of which I am not, and this podcast is not. It's not about practical psychology, but those guys are doing a great job in looking at how these Jungian observed figures within the self, within the unconscious, can actually be explored clinically and actually bring you to a better, give yourself better agency when it comes to these things. What I think Jung is doing in Mysterium Coniunctionis and in these late works is more like what Crowley is doing, and he's kind of like trying to look at the underpinnings of reality. It's like when he starts to notice that alchemical things in the past are echoing in the present day unconscious. I think it's very fascinating to him, and I think this is where that Chthonian or chthonic Saturnian force starts to be recognized, because you start to see within those archetypal theogony there that there actually is, a potential of entities, something like this, right? Okay, so let's go back into it. It says, apart from this compulsion, the injurious effects of the four planets is due to the fact that each of them exerts its specific influence on man and makes him a diversity of persons, whereas he should be one, right? The self is divided. There's conscious self, there's unconscious self, there's persona and ego. There's things that you can do with persona and ego. There's things that the unconscious wants to surface, and there's things that we must realize about the unconscious, whether it's shadow, whether it's complex resolution of complexes. All of these things are in the complexity of the self. And it's presumably Hermes who points out to Austin that something incorruptible is in his nature, which he shares with Agathodamon, something divine, obviously the germ of unity. This germ is the gold, the aurum philosophicum, the bird of Hermes, or the son of the bird, who is the same as the Philus philosophorum. So here we have, there's the conjunctio mysterium is that all these things can be united in a person, right? Right? So then we go into these sort of secrets of alchemy, let's call them, or the kind of the practices of alchemy that try to explore this, not in a psychological state, but in a physical state. So in the vas hermeticum, something must be enclosed until heated with moistness, till he clings to him and departed. The humidium radical, the prima materia, which is the original chaos in the sea. Some kind of coming to the consciousness seems indicated, and we know that the synthesis of the four was one of those main preoccupations of alchemy. I cause to come out of thee the spirits of the brethren, the planets, O sun, and I make thee a crown, which was like never seen. And I cause thee and them to be with me, and I will make thy kingdom vigorous. So the synthesis of the planets or the metals to form a crown will be within Hermes. The crown signifies kingly totality. And I think, again, just going back to what was Crowley doing when he says things like, well, what is magic? Crowley defines magic as all action is magic. I think there's an axiom that he says that all action is magic. So every time we are acting on the world, we're performing a kind of small magic, right? And I think for him, what the quest became, and I put this sort of the microcosm here. Here's like, the self as the connection of the union of sun and moon, of the union of the four quarters, right? I think this is where, in a way, it's the Crowleyan scientific method, which was against the dogmas of religion, but it was for the shamanic things about religion. I think this is also something that was attractive to Jung. Let's see what Edinger says about this stuff. He says the crown. We're talking about the crown here. And then going back to that quaternary, you can see here the sun in this image pictured as the seasons. There's 4 different versions of the sun as it's going around, like, as we see the sun traveling around the sky, we'll say, in that world view. But then we see it passing the zodiac. And suddenly it's like, this is a view from outside of space-time, if you look at it that way, right? We're looking at the sun seated 4 times at a table in 4 different seasons, right? And on the table you've got the animals that correspond to the constellations. So Ostanes caught in Heimarmene, we're going back now to what we just read in Jung. Edinger talks about Ostanes said, "Oh, save me, my God, for I stand between 2 exalted brilliancies and known for their wickedness, and between 2 dim lights. Each of them has reached me, and I not know how to go," right? When Jung reads this, he sees the following image. We've got the X in the center. Again, the X shows up for fans of Dark Journalist podcast. He has a whole series on X as a sort of stenographic symbol in plain sight. A lot of it going back into the same kind of material what Crowley would be seen as the Golden Dawn's Thelema's kind of modern take on the mystery schools. But I think what we see Jung sort of inadvertently, again, kind of like the thesis here of the Cat 2 Journals of Lovecraft's Providence, Lovecraft as inadvertently a non-mystic discovering the mystic by also being caught in Heimarmene in a way. He got caught up in his own creations of the gods, of his old ones. So then we go on. We're talking about that crown. Ostanes gets out of his dilemma, and the text continues in Hermes speaking, "I cause to come out of the spirits of thy brethren, the planets, O sun, and I make for thee a crown like that which was never seen, and I cause thee to be within me, and I will make thy kingdom vigorous." So when Ostanes gets disidentified from the self, the 7-fold crown can be synthesized. Jung writes, "The crown signifies the kingly totality. It stands for unity and is not subject to Heimarmene. This reminds us of the 7 or 12-raved crown of sun and the Agatha Daimon spirit wears on the Gnostic gem." So this is, so again, let's go to our astrology analogy. Does astrology affect us? Or is it more just a kind of reckoning system that we can know ourselves, or we could echolocute into the unconscious through some of the symbols that it makes present? So again, is it not influencing us? I always go back to the story of how math discovered the positions of Neptune and Uranus. They had to be there. The influence on our math, on our mathematical models, proved that there were more planets out there. And those planets do correspond to the discovery in, say, Freudian and Jungian times of a modern view, and not a religious view, but a modern psychological view of the unconscious. And you have planets like Uranus and Neptune. Liz Green writes a lot about this in her books on using those planets, Saturn, Neptune, Uranus, Pluto, as psychological planets, and especially in long historical flows. We did a podcast on Neptune and Led Zeppelin in the turn of the 60s, 70s. Like, why are those six? I just was recently looking into Ursula K. Le Guin's golden years, or 68 to 74, like some of her best works. It just seems like that was again, born under the right sign, I guess, right? So again, Jung uses a very interesting image in paragraph 7, another double quaternary, to illustrate how the opposites unite themselves. He extracts the mandala from the quoted passage. "In the Indian Ocean, the images of the heaven and earth, of summer and autumn, winter and spring, male and female. Thou callest this spiritual. What thou doest is probable. If corporeal, thou sayest the truth. If heavenly, thou liest not. If earthly, thou hast well spoken." So he's saying you don't have to think of these things as opposites where they're mutually exclusive of each other. You're actually not lying in both cases. Edinger continues, he says, "This gives us a glimpse into Jung's marvelous visual power. his image-making capacity. I don't think many of us would have extracted this figure from that text, but if we follow up, we'll see heaven, earth, summer, autumn, winter, spring. Yes, it all fits in there. And he puts it in Latin, but he's being true to the original Latin text. He's not prettying it up. It's a good example of the kind of capacity we need to develop if we're going to extract vivid imagery from the rather loosely presented material we encounter all the time. So this is great advice. Again, from, isn't this interesting? This is another version of this is another inversion. Now we've got the rod inside of the circle where we had it in our Saturnian image. Okay, so Mercurius becomes the peacemaker. Let's kind of go into that section. And like I said, I'm just going to go into a few sections of this, but we'll go into the next portion of, we've got the double quaternio. And he says, from this remarkable exercise, we learn of all things that this unifying agent is the spirit of Mercurius, and a singular spirit that causes the author to confess himself a member of the Ecclesia Spiritualis, for the spirit is God. This religious background is already apparent in the choice of the term pelican for the circular process, since this bird is a well-known allegory of Christ. The idea of Mercurius as a peacemaker, the mediator between the warring elements and producer of unity, probably goes back to Ephesians. And this is a quote of Ephesians. Now in Christ Jesus, you once were far off, but have been brought near to the blood of Christ. For he is our peace, who has made both one. He has broken down the dividing wall of hostility by abolishing in his flesh the law of commandments and ordinances that he creates in himself, one new man in place of two. The cross, the cornerstone, all of these things kind of come out of this. And, and then again, back to the Conjunctionis Mysterium, even that we explore in the Catu Journals. I think the section of this book that most addresses this kind of, I want to call it, I call it baggage, right? But I guess it's probably more eruditely termed something like historical progression of an idea, right? So you start, and I think this is coming out of the Moldenhauer book of Necromancy of Nyarlathotep. In the Necromancy of Nyarlathotep, we talk about those confusions of, what is necromancy really? Like, so then I think that some of the list of the things that necromancy is, it's, what about the idea of, so we think of the necromancer as speaking to the dead, but in a black magic kind of way. But then if we think of the Jesus story, it is a tale of a person dying and coming back to life. And even when we're reading the works of Jung and Crowley, we're kind of like reanimating, to use a Lovecraftian kind of funny term, we're kind of reanimating their living ideas into a new living brain who thinks it for them, right? So there is even a kind of, Nyarlathotep spell, is what Balsamo talks about it in saying that even reading itself is kind of necromantic. We take ideas of an author who could be dead and we reconstitute them. And then it goes into this whole series. What is resurrection now? What is reanimation? What's a zombie? What is the idea of dying and living? And now we see the Mysterium Coniunctionis is the way that is all put together, when the stars are right. And I think we have that here with what Jung calls a hermetic, Hermes becomes the psychopomp of this. But I believe there's also a different traditions can offer different solutions for this. There's a Saturnian version of this, right? So the Saturnian version of this, well, he's the great-grandfather of all of these gods, right? Like any god, any demigod had an Olympian as a father, and then had Saturn, Kronos in the genealogy. And I think what I'm kind of calling out here a bit is one reason why I don't see this Jungian system as purely psychological is it's, part of Jungian projection is what's going on here. Part of the creative activity, and I want to say it's a healthy activity when it's done in the right way, is we can expand into, and I brought up Ursula K. Le Guin before, you can think of it in Frank Herbert. They take these ideas and they expand upon them in the imagination. I think in that way, Hermes for sure is someone who is helping with the crown of language, right? Thoth Hermes, the Book of Thoth from Crowley, right, comes back. So that spiritual blood says, our Mercurius therefore is the same, and this is Gerhard Dorn, the true hermaphroditic atom of the microcosm. He's the same microcosm who contains within him the perfections, virtues, powers of soul in the dual sense of sun and gold, and who goes through the streets and houses of those planets, and in his retrogradation has obtained the power of above and below. So here he is. This is Hermes and Mercury as the crossroads guy, the again, Saturnian image from the Voodoo of Legba, right? Legba as the god of the crossroads, the psychopomp of the crossroads, where before he is to be likened to their marriage, he is evident in the white and the red that are conjoined in him. The sages have affirmed in their wisdom that all creatures are to be brought into one united substance. Accordingly, Mercurius is the crude form of the prima materium. And in the very truth, the original man disseminated through the physical world, in his subverted form, he is the reconstructed totality. Altogether, he is like the redeemer of Basilides, who mounts upon through the planetary spheres, conquering them or robbing them of their power. And he is returned to the power of soul, reminds of the above-mentioned passage in the Abu il-Qasim, where Hermes says that he unites the sun and the planet and causes them to be within him as his crown. So again, this kind of reads to me like a concept of agency, right? This is the spirit of the designation of the lapis as the crown of victory, right? This is what Jungian practitioners, would call it sort of the integration of the unconscious, right? The power of above and below, right? To know both what is conscious above and what is below unconscious. Besides this, our text talks about the Song of Songs, the red and white, my beloved is white and ruddy, which is from the Song of Songs. So that's the Hermes. And then we're going to go into the orphan, the widow, and the moon. And maybe we will go into this, and that will be the last section. So I think this is also where we're going to get into some Crowley. So he talks about the orphan, the widow, and the moon. And he talks about Hermes Trismegistus called the stone an orphan. The orphan is the name of the precious stone found in Albertus Magnus. The stone was called orphan because of its uniqueness. It was never seen elsewhere. It was wine-colored and it shone in the night. As Albertus Magnus was an authority on alchemy, he may have been the direct source both for Dorn and for Petrus Bonus. Orphan is the name of the gem that may mean something like the modern solitaire, right? So let's go into this. Mercurius as peacemaker. Now we're going to go into the orphan, the synonym of the philosopher's stone. This reminds Edinger of the inscription Jung carved into the Bollingen stone here seen. One side of the stone is the image of the eye. The other side has the inscription to which Jung says he put a composite of various alchemical quotations, including, I am an orphan alone, nevertheless I am found everywhere. I am one, but opposed to myself. I am youth, I am old at the same time. I have known neither father nor mother, because I have seen to be fletched out of the deep like a fish, fell like a white stone from heaven. In woods and mountains I roam, but I am hidden in the innermost soul of man. I am mortal for everyone, and yet I am touched by the cycle of the aeons. Wow, this is so interesting, because I heard a great Saturn story here. I was researching after Saturn escaped from his chains in Tartarus. He founded the Latin people with Janus, right? The other Titan, the two-faced god Janus. Both way looking, right? Which is an oppositorium Conjunctionis, right? But Saturn name, they're saying that the name Latium was the escaped or the hidden. So it's like sort of like, I think of Jean Valjean or something like this. It's like Saturn escapes from Tartarus to Latium, which is like lethe, forgetful, hidden, lithium, like something of escaped but hidden in plain sight. And this text, although is described by Mercury, again, the confusion of names. I was once brought a remarkable dream, is Edinger, from his ego and archetype. It was dreamt by a woman who had to endure a particularly large number of frustrations that most people were spared. A biological satisfaction is denied her by life. And this is very hard for her to come to terms with. At one time, she dreamt that her doorbell rang. She went to the door and opened it, and there on the doorstep was a foundling. The peculiar nature of this foundling was it was still attached to an umbilical cord, and the umbilical cord went up to heaven. And that would be an example of an orphan archetype. It had to be fetched out of the deep like a fish, like it fell on a white stone from heaven. So wow, that's cool, Dr. Edinger. Next, he comes up to this concept of the orphan and the son of the widow. The widow and the children of the widow appears to be of a Manichaean origin. The Manichaeans themselves were called the children of the widow. Now, you know, the Manichaeans also very interesting when it comes to the oppositorium, right? They believe that the world is good and evil fighting in the person, which again, it kind of goes back to the shadow work. It goes back to the idea of integration. The orphan referred to by Hermes must therefore have his counterpart in the vidua, the widow, in her prima materia. For this, there are synonyms such as mater, matrix, the matrix comes, Venus, Regina, Femina, Virgo, Puella, Virgin at the center of the earth, Luna, Meretrix, Vetula, and most specific, the Vetula extentue, the enfeeblement and exhausted Mater Alchemia, who is dopsical in the lower limbs and paralyzed from the knee down. And finally, virago. And these are all symptoms according to the virginal maternal quality of the prima materia, produced by Michael Mayer. And then this kind of leads us eventually into this idea of, he talks about the redemptrix. Then he starts to go, another tradition to be considered to regard the widow is the Kabbalah. Therefore, abandon Malkutheth is the widow, as Nora Rosenthal says, Almana, widow. So he starts to look at the Kefir, Trefereth, Yesod. So now he's into the tree of life stuff. Now, here we go. What are we doing here? I mean, okay, he has to be... Obviously, the alchemists of old thought of these things, but now we're starting to see, what he's doing in his late work is more akin to, I would say, Crowley's work. I'm going to find the Tree of Life in here, in a large image. I know there's one in here somewhere. It's more akin to what Crowley's work is, right? I mean, the idea here is he's exploring these, he calls it a Mysterium Coniunctionis, right? He's exploring the mystery of the conjunction. Here we go, right? A few principles and correspondence of the Kabbalah, the tree of life, the key scale, right? You see there's orbs around it. And then we have number put in. We have the crown appears now, the beauty, strength, mercy, understanding, foundation, the moon, the earth, Venus, Mercury, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, right? The crown corresponds to the upward growing root of the tree. Yesod symbolizes the general regions of the original man, whose head is Kefir. Malkuth, confirming the archetypal pattern underlying feminine principle. So we start to have him exploring the nature of mysticism in the Kabbalah and the alchemical links here, right? So what's interesting to me, just in note, is how we've gone now from psychology into Kabbalic views. So the symbolism of the widow, Jung says in the Sephirotic tree, it was called the widow. Now, what is the Sephirotic tree? There's another occasion later to discuss a bit about this Kabbalistic symbolism in the tree. But in order to know what Jung is talking about here, I thought a few remarks would be useful. According to the symbolism, the tree is an image of the tenfold emanation of the Godhead. It is an image of God unfolded into 10 aspects, so to speak. And it is thought that the upside-down tree, with its roots in heaven and its branches down on the earth, without getting into them, all 10 of those aspects of the Godhead, let's just talk about the four so-called central pillars. I wanted to take a moment there just to sort of show you, I had put together this genealogy book. And I just wanted to share this image because it is kind of like a conjunctio. Like if you see this image of the tree with the roots, right, as a conjunctio, like what is up? If we just flip this, right? If we flip this to be this way, right, we kind of see, what the inversion looks like, or if we put it this way, right? So yeah, I just wanted to share that. Finally, it ends on the topic of the moon. It says, the identification of the lunar forms a link with alchemy and other examples of the process by which the patristic symbols of spouses and sponsa has been assimilated much earlier. It is the repetition of the way the original pagan Hieros Gamos was absorbed into the figurative language of the church fathers. The strict application of the soul lunar allegory might have been the embarrassment to the church, although the idea of the dying church does take into account a certain extent, of the transience of all created things. All created things are transient, right? I do not mention the fact that you criticize the significance of the ecclesiastical soul lunar allegory. Instead, Jung says, I want to emphasize it because the moon, standing in the borders of the sublunary world ruled by evil, has to share not only the world of light, but also the daimonic world of darkness, as our author clearly hints. This is why her changefulness is so significant symbolically. She is duplex, immutable like Mercurius, and like him a mediator, hence the identification in alchemy. And I kind of want to add here to something he's not calling out, but I also, again, here he goes, talks about the darkness of the moon. This is where I was going to go. It says, once it is said, they have made ready their arrows in the quiver to shoot in the darkness of the moon at the upright of heart. It's clear that Augustine did not understand that the wounding as an activity of the new moon itself, but in accordance with the principle omne malum ab homine, as the result of man's wickedness. At the same time, the addition of obscura luna, in which there's no warrant in the original test, shows how much the new moon is involved. This hint of the admitted dangerousness of the moon is confirmed when Augustine, a few sentences later, cites, on the days justice shall flourish, the abundance of peace until the moon be destroyed. And I think that this is about a lunar cycle. I would kind of guess it's about a lunar cycle. To eliminate the moon from creation is therefore as desirable as the elimination of death. The negative assessment of the moon takes full account of her dark side. Again, I always think of this as setting, right? So I think the idea of the setting of the sun, the moon is the shadow of the sun, and also the idea of alchemical, the blackening phase, right? When we talk about scorching, look not upon me because I am black, the sun hath scorched me. This is from the Song of Songs. But again, there's a sort of the idea of the alchemical burning, the new moon, the Christian interpretation of the nuptial embrace. Right, so all of those great things that happen at night, right? What's interesting when we look at modern thinking, right? We've learned that sleeping is more than just resting the body. It's when the body actually rebuilds itself, right? The plant's growing at night, right? And I think this is kind of that experimental, I want to call it experimental practice, if we could call it in Crowley as well. If we just take a look at 641. There's one thing I wanted to call out here. Yeah, and I guess we can kind of go back to that. The formula is of the most universal aspect. We're going to call this the tetragrammaton, right? So this is the four, earth, fire, water, such, Yod, He, Vav, He, the ineffable name of the Hebrews. The four letters represent the four elements. The formula is of the most universal aspect, as all things are necessarily comprehended by it, but its use in magical ceremony is little understood. The climax of the formula is one sense before even the formulation of Yod. For the Yod is the most divine aspect of the force. The remaining letters are but a solidification of the same thing. It must be understood that we here are speaking of the whole ceremony considered as a whole, not merely as the formula in which Yod is the god invoked, He, the archangel, and so on. In order to understand the ceremony of the formula, we must take it to the extended view of the four weapons that we have talked about. The formation of the Yod and the formation of the first creative force of the Father, who is called self-begotten, unto whom it is said, Thou hast formulated thy father and made fertile thy mother. Again, when I hear that, made fertile thy mother, again, I think of this as the darkness of earth buried below the ground, as the same as the darkness of space, right? I kind of like make that connection. Like this is where you have to collapse the wave in a way, right? So the distance of space is also the closeness of the distance of the underworld, which is the fertility. Adding to the He and the Yod and the marriage of the Father and the great co-equal mother, who is the reflection of the Nuit as of the Hadith. Their union brings forth the son. Finally, the daughter is produced. She is both the twin sister and the daughter. So now we have father, mother, son, daughter. So if a quaternary gets created, his mission is to redeem her by making her his bride. The result of this set upon her in the throne of her mother. And only she whose youthful embrace can reawaken the eld of the All-Father in this complex family relation, symbolizing the whole course of the universe. It will be said, after all, the climax at the end in the second half of the formula, which symbolizes the great work, which is the alchemical work, which we are pledged to accomplish. The first step is the attainment of the knowledge and the conversation of the holy guardian angel, which constitutes the adept of the inner order. Of the last step, we cannot speak, which is really, this is going beyond. It's breaking with the guardian angel, as we learn about later in Golden Dawn and Crowley's work. You have to break with that guardian angel. And again, is this what the people want to talk about when they say they don't believe in astrology? I'm not sure. They're just breaking with the guardian angel because they're breaking out of the system. I just think it's another set of symbols. To put it, like, to slow that down, I met a mathematician once, and I kind of had this, as I do, come up with these wacky ideas. I had this idea of an alternative to mathematics. And the mathematician got very angry, because he was like, no, you can still describe it as mathematics. And some part of me, when I hear the chthonic guys say that it's not an astrological thing because they want to move beyond the clockworks, I don't think that they want to move beyond the clockworks. I think what they really want to do in the great work, and as part of the Mysterium Coniunctionis, is I think that they want to do what Lovecraft would kind of call, they want to do something non-Euclidean. They want to do something outside of time, And I think one of the exercises that, if you guys are interested in this kind of topic, go check out the bookstore for this, Cat 2 Journals of Lovecraft's Providence. The translation work that goes into the various Necronomicon fragments, which can be seen as almost nonsensical. Translation of nonsensical magic texts, right? Here we have a magic fragment. The act of translating the layers of that fragment is an exercise in and of itself of kind of grammar unfolding in symbolic time, right? So we just say, in speaking of the astrology of Cthulhu as the body of astrological charts, the way forward is marked both by Jung's psychological interest in various paranormal phenomena and by the revised look at the view of late scholasticism regarding the macrocosm and microcosmic, the causality of cycles and similitudes as they relate to cosmic pessimism. What follows is a discussion of the psychological phenomenon of the astrological, especially in the forms of the psychoanalytics of the Cthulhu mythos in relation to the phrase when the stars are right. Additionally, this psychoanalytic gaze will be turned upon the astrological writings as a kind of grammar unfolding in symbolic time. The goal here is to look at the psychoanalytic valence of concepts left behind in the thought of scholastics, but perhaps very relevant to the deciphering of the drive behind Lovecraft's notion of both dead dreaming and when the stars are right. Right. So I think that while of course the language of either religion or psychology or Lovecraftian themes or it's Crowley, in the end, it is a kind of exercise. It's a human exercise in learning and knowledge. And I would like to continue this Mysterium Coniunctionis journey. And I want to do it looking at it alongside with Crowley. So we kind of made it through the introduction, the first couple paragraphs. Hope this was interesting to you guys. We'll see you in podcast number 65. I did want to do an episode on Alone of Her Sex, the myth of the cult of the Virgin Mary. But I think I might blend this into a later chapter in Mysterium Coniunctionis where we can talk about this. I think this is a very interesting book. I also want to do one on Lazarus. I got the Lazarus book here. So, let us know in the comments what you guys think. We'll see you in the next podcast. Take a look at our bookstore. Thank you for your subscriptions, and check out our Patreon, and we'll talk to you in the next podcast. Thanks a lot. Hope everyone is well. Have a good week. Take care. Bye-bye.